Hello and welcome to the Sysadmin Tutorials YouTube channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at the installation and setup of VMware ESXi 6.7. I'm going to be installing this in a nested environment, and I'm currently logged into my base vCenter server where I'll be installing my ESXi VM. I've already gone ahead and created a resource group called vSphere 67 Lab, and I'll right click on that, select New Virtual Machine, and then New Virtual Machine once again. Select Create a New Virtual Machine and then click Next. We'll give our virtual machine a name. I'll be calling mine ESXi 67-1. And if you expand your data center, we can pick a folder where we want to install the virtual machine. Next, I'll select my resource group called vSphere 67 Lab. I'll be placing this virtual machine on my NFS data store called Synology 1815 NFS1. It has 1.26 terabytes of free space. We'll just make sure that the compatibility is set to ESXi 6.5 and later. Now next to Guest OS family, we'll drop down this menu and select Other. And for Guest OS version, we'll also drop that down, and we're going to be selecting VMware ESXi 6.5. We'll click Next. I'm going to be giving my virtual machine 4 CPUs and 16 gig of RAM. The hard drive space I'm going to be leaving on the default of 40 gig. And one other option that we need to select is if we expand the CPUs, we're going to tick Hardware Virtualization. Expose Hardware Assisted Virtualization to the Guest OS. Another thing that you might do in this window is install additional network cards for storage and vMotion, for example. Next, I'll click on VM Options, and I'll expand Boot Options, and we'll select the next time that the virtual machine boots, force entry into the EFI setup screen. And we'll click Next. Here we'll have a summary of all of our settings, and I'll click Finish. Okay, our virtual machine has been created on the left-hand side here, and we'll go ahead and power on our virtual machine. Next, I want to launch the console, so I'll just click on the screen here. I already have the VMware Remote Console installed here. The other option in launching a console is if we go back to our vCenter server, we can click on this little cog on the bottom right-hand corner, and we can select Launch Web Console, which will open the console in your browser. What I want to do in this screen is select Enter Setup and press Enter on Configure Boot Options, and we'll select Change Boot Order. I'm going to press Enter on this screen, and I'll go down to my CD-ROM and I'll press the plus symbol on this keyboard. This will move it up to the top. Next, I'll have Virtual Disk, and we might also move the network up as well. And we'll press Enter, and now we'll select Commit Changes and Exit. Before we exit the Boot Maintenance Manager, we're going to be mounting the ISO CD for the ESXi 6.7 virtual machine. To do that, I'm going to select VMRC, Removable Devices, CD/DVD drive, and then Connect to Disk Image File. I'll select my 6.7 ISO image here and click Open. Now back in the Boot Maintenance Manager, we'll go down and exit it, and we'll select Reset the System. As you can see, the VMware ESXi 6.7 installer has begun. And now we're ready to begin the installation. On the first screen, we'll just press Enter. Next, we'll press F11 to accept the end user license agreement. The installer's found our 40 gig hard drive, and that's where we're going to be installing the ESXi 6.7. So on this screen, we'll just press Enter. I'm going to be selecting US default for the keyboard layout. And on this screen, I'm going to enter in my root password. Once you've entered in the password, you can press Enter. And next, we'll press F11 to confirm the installation. Once the installation is complete, it notifies you that you have an evaluation mode for 60 days. And before we reboot, we'll just remove the ISO image. So I'm going to press Ctrl-Alt to exit this console screen. select VMRC, removable devices, CD/DVD drive, and disconnect this ISO image. Once it's disconnected, we can click back in the console window and press enter to reboot. Now that ESXi 6.7 has booted up, we can press F2 to customize the system. We'll type in our password that we entered in during the setup phase. And you're going to see that the system customization is pretty much similar to previous versions of ESXi. So we'll just run through these pretty quickly so we can spend more time in the GUI. First up, let's configure our management network. If you have multiple adapters, you can press enter here, and you'll see a list of all the network cards that you have available in the VM. If you don't want VMNIC 0 to be your management adapter, you can simply move the selection up and down and press spacebar to select another network card. But because we've only got one in this system, we don't need to worry about that, so I'm going to press escape. You can also set up tagged VLANs here by pressing enter and entering in the VLAN ID. Next, I'll select IPv4 configuration and press enter. Here we have a few options. You can either completely disable IPv4. We can use dynamic IPv4, which means it'll obtain an IP address from a DHCP server. Or we can set a static IPv4 address. And that's what I'm going to be doing here. Now I'll just enter in my IP address, subnet mask, and default gateway. Once the IP addresses have been entered, we can press enter to confirm them. Next we have the IPv6 configuration. I usually come in here and disable it if it's not required. Otherwise you can use dynamic or set static IPv6 addresses. In the DNS configuration, we have an option to obtain the DNS server addresses via DHCP, or we can set static DNS server addresses. I'll be setting up my primary DNS server, and I'll enter in the host name of the virtual machine. We'll press enter to confirm that. In custom DNS suffixes, I'm going to enter in my DNS suffix and press enter. Now I'll press escape and I'll press Y to reboot the host. Once our ESXi host is rebooted, we'll just go in and just take a look at the last few settings. So we'll press F2, enter in our password. The first option we'll have a look at is Restart Management Network. The main reason you'll use Restart Management Network would be to renew a DHCP lease. If we are going to use this option, there may be a brief network outage on the management network, as is described on the right-hand side. Next up, we'll take a look at Test Management Network. If we press enter into this option, we can see we're able to ping up to 3 IP addresses for troubleshooting, and we can also attempt to resolve a DNS name. My ping is successful, so I'll press OK. Next up, we've got some network restore options. If we have lost network connectivity to our ESXi host, we can use restore network settings. This will set the IP address back to DHCP, and we must have console access to reconfigure the network settings after the restore has completed. If your ESXi server has been joined to a vCenter server and is a member of a vSphere distributed switch, you can also restore the ESXi server's VDS settings. Configure keyboard gives us some options of the keyboard layout that you wish to use. Within troubleshooting options, we can enable the ESXi shell, and I will demo that right now. If we press enter, the shell is now enabled. And if we press Alt F1, we're able to log in to the ESXi shell. Pressing Alt F2 returns to the GUI. We have an option to also enable SSH to the ESXi host. We can modify the client UI idle timeouts. By default it is 10 minutes. And we also have the option to restart the management agents. Next up, we can view the system logs, and those logs are syslog, VMKernel, config, management agent, virtual center agent, and VMware ESXi observation log. I'll press number 2 just to take a quick look into the VMKernel. And if you're looking for something in particular, you can press /, type in a keyword or a regular expression. And as you can see, your search query has been highlighted in the output. I'll press Q to quit. Next up, we'll view the support information. On the right-hand side, we can see that the license I'm using is an evaluation license. We can also see our SSL thumbprint. And if I press page down, I can see some additional host firmware information. Last but not least, we can select Reset System Configuration. This option will reset your ESXi server to factory defaults. I'm going to press Escape now, and it's going to log me out of the GUI. Next up, we'll be taking a look at the ESXi 6.7 web user interface. To access the ESXi 6.7 web interface, you can simply head on over to your web browser and type in https:// followed by the management IP address. You can accept the certificate and proceed. To log in, I'll just simply type in my root username and password. First up, we're asked if we want to join the VMware's Customer Experience Improvement Program. Leave this box ticked if you wish to join the program, otherwise simply untick it and click OK. Let's now take a look at the host information screen. On the left-hand side here, you can see a list of the hardware that's contained within the physical host. We can see such things as our CPU, memory, any virtual flash that's been installed, our host name, IP addresses, DNS servers, default gateway, the network that we're currently connected to, as well as our local VMFS6 data store. On the right-hand side, we can see our image profile, which lists our ESXi version and build number. It also lists if HA has been configured and if vMotion is supported. In the next window, we have our system information, which displays our time and date. Later on in the video, I'm going to be showing you how to set the time and date to a NTP server. We can also see any asset tag and serial number assigned to the physical host, the BIOS version and the BIOS release date. And lastly, on this screen, we can see some performance information. This graph shows the consumed host CPU and consumed host memory. And at any point in time, we can move the mouse across and it will highlight the percentages for the CPU and gigabytes for the memory. We'll now move on to adjusting the date and time of this host. Because we enabled the ESXi shell in the console user interface, we get the following warning appear. I'm going to show you how to disable the ESXi shell through the host settings. Once we disable the shell, the warning will disappear. We'll click on Manage. Make sure you're on the System tab, Date and Time, and we'll click Edit Settings. I'm going to set the NTP server startup policy to start and stop with the host. And I'm also going to enter in my NTP server, which is my Active Directory domain controller. Alternatively, you can set the time manually by selecting Manually Configure the Date and Time on this host. Click Save. If you've selected to use an NTP server, we can click on Actions, NTP Service, and Start. We can see the NTP server status is now running. Next, we'll click on Swap. This area is the ESXi system swap. This is what the ESXi host itself can use for its swap. The options are a selected data store, host case, which will be SSD, or local swap, which is basically letting the ESXi determine the best location. Now we'll take a look at Auto Start. Listed here are the Auto Start global settings. However, once you have created one or more virtual machines, you can specify individual auto start settings per VM. For example, we can delay start of the VM by 120 seconds, delay stopping the VM by 120 seconds, set a stop action of either system default, which takes into consideration the global settings, power off, suspend, or shut down. Lastly, we can set the VM auto start to not start until a system heartbeat is received. Within advanced settings, there are quite a few unique ESXi settings to further customize the host. However, unless you have experience in this area or have been advised by VMware to change certain settings, I would leave them set as default. We'll move on to the Hardware tab now. Within the Hardware tab, we can see a list of PCI devices. Clicking on each PCI address displays further information about the specific PCI device. Next up is Power Management. By default, the active policy is balanced. However, we can change that by clicking on Change Policy. And as you can see, we can select a power policy to support our needs. Within licensing, we can see our product key, expiration date, and what features have been enabled. As you can see, I'm running an evaluation license that expires on August the 17th. The evaluation license includes all the features. Once you have received your product key, you can simply click on Assign License, enter in your key, and the license will be applied to your host. Let's click on Services. This is a current list of services that are either running or stopped. And if you remember when we were going through the customization of ESXi, we did enable the ESXi shell, and that is this service right here. So as you can see, it is running, and what we'll do is we'll click on Stop. If you do leave either the ESXi shell or SSH server running, you will get a warning message within the web UI. If you would like to leave these services running and not get the warning message, we can suppress them within the advanced settings. I'm going to show you how to do that now. If we click on the System tab and go into Advanced Settings, in the search we'll type in user vars, highlight user vars.suppress shell warning, click Edit Options and set the value to 1. So as you can see, the warning message has now disappeared on the host summary page. So we'll head back to where we were, and we'll now select Security and Users. First off, we'll start with acceptance level. The acceptance level is how strict you wish to be on installing any VIB files. For example, only accept VIB files that are VMware signed and certified, reject all other VIB files. We'll click on Authentication. These authentication settings are to do with logging into ESXi, such as the web GUI. Here we can join an Active Directory domain and even enable smart card authentication. Next is certificates. By default, ESXi is installed with a self-signed certificate. You also have the option to import your own certificate by clicking on Import New Certificate, or you can even generate a FQDN or IP signing request. If we click on Users, by default the root user exists here. We can create additional users by clicking on Add User and entering a username, description, and password. We can change the root user password here by highlighting the user root and clicking on Edit User. By default, ESXi contains 6 default roles ranging from full administrator access down to read-only access. Roles are assigned to users. You also have the ability to add your own custom roles by clicking Add Role. On lockdown mode, we have 3 options. We can either leave it disabled. We can have strict lockdown, which means that users can only log in via vCenter. And lastly, we have normal lockdown, which means users can only log in via the direct console user interface and vCenter server. I'll be leaving mine on disabled. And within the lockdown mode, we can also add user exceptions. Simply enter in the username that you wish to add the exception for. Now we'll move on to monitor. First up, we can see the performance graphs for CPUs. We're also able to see performance graphs for memory, network, and disk. We can change colors between default colors and high contrast colors. And if you're using ESXi by itself, you will only be able to view the last hour of performance data. Clicking on the Hardware tab, we can see system sensor information. Because we're running in a nested ESXi environment, my sensor information data is unavailable. However, if you're running on a physical server, you'll see some sensor information listed here. An example of sensors that you may see could be fans, batteries, power supplies, etc. Next up is the storage health data. Within this window, you can see the storage name, whether it is healthy or not, and a description. To enable this, you must turn on the SIM agent with the command that is on the screen now. Next up is events. This is a log of all the events that have occurred on the ESXi server. Next is the Tasks tab. This is a list of all the tasks that have been executed on the ESXi server, including the start times, completed times, and results. Clicking on the Logs tab, we can view the system logs. To view one of the system logs listed here, we can simply select it. And in the center here, we can see all the information of that particular log file. In this case, we're looking at vpxa.log. And let's say we just want to search on errors. So we can simply type error in the search field and press enter. And the word error is highlighted throughout the log. We also have this important button at the top called Generate Support Bundle. When you create a VMware support request, you can generate a support bundle that will help speed up troubleshooting time and also help assist the VMware engineer. Clicking on the Notifications tab, we can see a list of notifications from the ESXi server. Some example of notifications that you might see here is that the ESXi server is connected to a vCenter server or that ESXi shell is enabled. Now let's click over to Virtual Machines and let's create our first virtual machine. I'll click Create Register VM and the new virtual machine wizard begins. I will select Create a new virtual machine, click Next. I'm going to be naming the virtual machine Win 2016-1. I'll leave the compatibility on ESXi 6.7. The guest OS family is going to be Windows. And the OS version, we're going to scroll down to Windows Server 2016 64-bit. And click Next. We're going to store this virtual machine on the local data store of the ESXi server. The local data store is called Data Store 1. I've got this error message pop up straight away, notifying me that the hard disk size that we wish to set here, which is 40 gig, is actually more than what the local data store can handle. And that's because by default it's set as thick provisioned lazily zeroed. So what we'll do is set it to thin provisioned and we'll be able to continue with that. The warning changes to say that we've overcommitted the data store and that we should increase the data store's capacity. We can also set the disk size smaller than 40 gigs so that it's within the data store limits. Here I'll set it to 30 gig. We'll give it 2 CPUs, 4 gig of memory. For location, the wizard will create a folder based on the virtual machine's name you entered previously. I will leave the defaults set as shares on normal, IOPS limit on unlimited, controller location as SCSI controller 0, SCSI ID 0, and disk mode as dependent. SCSI controller 0, SATA controller 0, USB controller 1 I'll be leaving as default. On network adapter 1, I'll be changing the adapter type to VMXnet3. CD DVD drive I'll be leaving as default. And video card I'll be leaving as default. However, it's worth to note that you can change the total video memory and also the 3D memory. We'll click Next. And here's a summary of our virtual machine settings. If you're happy with this, we'll click Finish and the virtual machine will be created. The virtual machine is now ready to install Windows 2016. One thing you might want to do, which was similar to what we did with our ESXi virtual machine, is edit the settings, click on VM options, go to boot options, and select force BIOS setup. So the next time the virtual machine boots, it goes straight into the BIOS. If I click on the virtual machine and then click on the play button here, it will start the virtual machine and also launch the console. Within this console, we can't mount the DVD drive, so I'm going to have to launch VMRC. Okay, what we want to do now is click on Actions, Console, Launch Remote Console. And in the remote console, we want to connect the Windows Server 2016 ISO file. Okay, I'm going to select boot normally. And the Windows 2016 installation begins. I'm not going to bore you with the installation of Windows Server 2016, but you can go ahead and complete that in your own time. I'll now be closing the console windows. Next up, we're going to be taking a look at storage. What we can see here is our local data store, and alongside that, information such as its capacity. What I usually like to do is rename these data stores to something such as the name of the host _ local. The reason for doing that is once they're connected into vCenter, if you have multiple ESXi hosts, all with their local data stores set as data store 1, you'll start to see data store 1, data store 1 bracket 1, data store 1 bracket 2, and so on and so on. So I like to rename them, which makes them easier to identify later on. Within storage, we can also see the adapters. These are the storage adapters. Some other things you might see in here are iSCSI adapters or fiber channel HBAs. To configure an iSCSI adapter, you can simply select Configure iSCSI. You can select Enabled. The name and alias is generated automatically for you. You have some authentication options here. Network port bindings bind an iSCSI adapter to a VMKernel NIC. I haven't created an iSCSI VMK port yet, but if I did have one, you can click on Add Port Binding, select the VMK number here. It will be connected to a previously configured iSCSI port group. The TCPIP stack would be default, and then you'll have your IP address settings of your iSCSI network adapter. For static targets, you can add a static target by clicking on the button here. The static target will be your storage system's iSCSI IP address. You can also click on Add Dynamic Target. To add a dynamic target, type in one of the iSCSI target IP addresses. What this will do is automatically find all target iSCSI IPs for that storage system. And then you can simply save the configuration. Once you save it, you'll see an iSCSI network adapter appear in here. The other feature we can look at here is the rescan button. By selecting one of the storage adapters and clicking on rescan, it will discover any newly attached LUNs. Within the devices tab, we can see a list of devices that are locally attached to the server. So we can see we have a VMware disk, which is our data store number 1 of 40 gig capacity. And we also have a CD-ROM attached to it. We'll move over to the networking now. Within networking, we can see that we have 2 port groups. One is the VM network, which is where we'll be placing our virtual machines. And the second is our management network. The management network is where we have our VMK0, which is the management IP address of our ESXi server. We can simply add port groups by clicking on Add Port Group, giving the port group a name, optionally a VLAN ID, connecting it to a virtual switch, and also optionally setting security for promiscuous mode, MAC address changes, and forged transmits. On the virtual switches tab, we have a list of our virtual switches. By default, the system's created vSwitch 0. You can see on vSwitch 0 that we have 2 port groups assigned. Those 2 port groups are in the previous tab, VM Network and Management Network. We can right click on the vSwitch and select Edit Settings. From the settings, we can change the MTU size. We can change the uplink NIC. However, in this demo, I only have one NIC connected. Within link discovery, we have the Cisco Discovery Protocol. We can set this to listen, advertise, both, or completely disable it by setting none. Within the security options, we have promiscuous mode, MAC address changes, and forged transmits. For either one of them, we can set as accept or reject. Within NIC teaming, the default is route based on originating port ID. However, you can select other options. If you would like your physical switch to make the load balancing decisions for you, you can select route based on IP. If you wish the virtual switch to make the load balancing decisions, you can select either route based on originating port ID or route based on source MAC hash. Lastly, if you wish to run an active passive setup, you can select use explicit failover order. Within network failover detection, we have two options. Link status only works on whether the link port is up or down. Beacon only sends probes onto the wire. Those probes need to be received on all NICs, otherwise a NIC is considered down. The notify switch option allows ESXi to notify this physical switch of the virtual machine's MAC addresses. Failback fails a downed NIC back to active once it returns to an online status. Failover order allows you to specify which NIC is primary and which NIC is in standby. The NIC teaming options really only come into effect if there are more than one network card connected to the host. And lastly, we have traffic shaping. Traffic shaping can be enabled or disabled. You can also specify an average and peak bandwidth, as well as allowing a burst size. Thing to note here is that traffic shaping on a vSwitch is outbound only. On the Physical NICs tab, we can see a list of all the physical network cards. If we highlight the card and select Edit Settings, we have the option of changing the link speed and duplex. Next is VMKernel Knicks. Listed here we have our management VMKernel NIC called VMK0. Some other VMKernel NICs that you may add could be NFS storage NICs, vMotion NICs, iSCSI NICs, etc. Next we'll take a look at TCPIP stacks. We have three TCPIP stacks by default. A TCPIP stack is a separate IP space, meaning it contains its own routing table. What I can do with this is set up a different default gateway for each stack. For example, if I configure a VMKernel port for vMotion and assign it to the vMotion TCPIP stack, it will use the default gateway from the vMotion stack and not the default gateway from the default TCPIP stack. Last but not least, we have the firewall rules. In the left-hand side column, we have the name of the service. So for example, NTP client. We can see that the outgoing port is 123, UDP is the protocol, and we can see that NTP client is currently running. If we right-click on NTP client and select Edit Settings, we can see that all connections from all IP addresses are allowed to use this firewall rule. If we check back on our virtual machine that we created previously, we can see that we have a basic performance snippet on the right side for CPU, memory, and storage. And scrolling down, we have some general information as well as the hardware configuration and resource consumption. We can also see the performance summary for the last hour on consumed CPU, ready %, and consumed host memory. The CPU ready % metric is quite important and can indicate if your VMs are experiencing host CPU contention. If you are seeing your CPU ready above 5% and you notice your VMs are not as responsive as they used to be, it might be time to upgrade your host CPUs. Now this completes the video on setting up the new VMware ESXi 6.7. I hope that you've gotten some value out of this video and it's helped you to deploy and understand ESXi 6.7. Thank you very much for watching and see you in the next video.